Thank you everybody for joining us today for our webinar, Reimagine the Way You Program with IDL for VS Code. So we'll go ahead and get started with a couple of housekeeping items before we get to introductions for our speakers today. First and foremost, this webinar is being recorded. So just like all our other webinars that we've got, the slides and a recording will be sent within a couple business days. Excuse me. Little frog in my throat there. Additionally, as we're going through, feel free to use the questions chat box in the GoToWebinar panel to ask any questions as you go. The webinar style for today is much more demo and kind of unscripted. So, questions will help make sure that you guys get the most value from Chris and I's time today. So kind of with that, let's go ahead and talk about our presenters today. So my name is Zach Norman. I'm one of our product managers. You've probably seen me on some of our What's New webinars if you ever watch those. And I'm lucky enough to be joined by Chris Torrance, who is our IDL lead software engineer. Chris Torrance has been with the company for a very long time. He had a short hiatus, but he's back. And so he's very knowledgeable with IDL and has been a long-time IDL user as well. Chris, is there anything else that you'd like to say about yourself before we jump in?
Well, thanks, Zach. I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here and talking about the IDL for VS Code extension. And just one note, so let's see, Zach said I've been here actually since 1999, and I've worked on a lot of different IDL versions since then. And I'm now the IDL lead software engineer. However, with that being said, I want to point out that the VS Code extension that we're talking about today was written almost entirely by Zach, and with just a little bit of input from me. And so a lot of the things that you're going to see today are written by our very own Zach. And that's all I want to say.
More than a little input from you, Chris. That's all I'll say. But thank you. So, all right. So just a little bit of context today for today's webinar. As I mentioned before, is that this is going to be a little bit different than we normally how we normally go about webinars. We've got like 3 slides maybe, or maybe it's 5, without much content in them. We're really focused on kind of a set of agenda items that Chris and I are going to walk through and actually show. So, if you've got questions as we go, feel free to chime in. We're going to talk about basically the IDL for VS Code extension, how to get set up, and a few other things. We'll get to a little bit more information about that here in a second. Before we do, one of the things I want to give a little bit of context for is if you are an IDL user and Visual Studio Code, or VS Code, as Chris and I say a lot, is new to you. Visual Studio Code is a text editor, but much more than a text editor. It's a full-featured programming developer environment. It has many extensions. Probably one of my favorite things about it is that you can really customize it to be your own. And it has support for many languages as well. So it's kind of one editor to rule them all a little bit. And if there's people here who are familiar with Visual Studio Code but not IDL, IDL is our programming language, and IDL stands for Interactive Data Language. It's been around for quite a while. Its focus is really on array-based processing, and it really shines when it comes to things like image analysis. We also have another product called ENVI, and a large portion of ENVI is actually based in IDL. We actually have an IDL API for ENVI, and if we create new image processing algorithms, IDL is one of the places that we start. So that's our quick little intro. With that, let's just see a couple of the bullets that we're going to be walking through today. Really kind of the goal is that we're going to show how to install the extension, some of the high-level differences with the IDL workbench if you are an IDL user. We'll talk a little bit about configuration, and then kind of the second half of the webinar, we're going to be focused on how to actually run things and talking about IDL notebooks as well. So some just kind of little factual differences and high level features to get started with, and then the stuff that I think is a little bit more exciting, running pro code and notebooks as well. So with that, and I'm going to show this live here in just a second, but if you don't have the extension already installed, I'm actually going to show the installation process and everything live. So if you would like to get the extension, if you are within Visual Studio Code, if you click on the extension sidebar, which is a little icon that has the little kind of blocks, and if you just search for IDL for VS Code, the result all the way up there at the top is the one that you're looking for. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to show this here in just a second, and we'll get started. So let me move my slides here out of the way, and I'm going to pop over to Visual Studio Code. So here I'm looking at the extensions, little sidebar entry here. If I search IDL for VS Code, we'll give it a second to come through. We'll see that I actually already have it installed. I just disabled it so that we could show this here kind of live and what this process looks like. I'm going to click on the enable button. If you haven't installed it, you're going to see install instead of enable. If you're looking over at the search results here, there's a whole bunch of other things that have IDL in the name. There's some legacy extensions that have very basic functionality and not nearly as feature filled as the one that we've got officially created by us. So with this, once it starts up, you'll see that there's a couple of little buttons here up at the top of the screen. One of the things that's included as part of the extension is we have some color themes. If I click on set color theme here, you'll get to see a little bit of a preview of the 3 color themes that we've got. We have retro IDL, which I'm showing right here, where retro IDL is a throwback to Eclipse and the IDL workbench. So a lot of the colors for syntax and IDL code look about the same. Novus and Neon IDL are 2 custom dark mode themes that we've created, which are built off of open source themes with some little custom tweaks for colors and little IDL styles to make IDL code look a little bit more familiar as well. My personal preference, I like Novus IDL. This is based off of the Atom 1 dark theme, which is the one that I am using within VS Code when I don't have the IDL extension installed or we might be doing development. One of the other things that I want to call out here real quick, we have this file icon theme. So Visual Studio Code has a different icon for profiles. It's this little owl looking icon. And as part of our extension, we replace that icon with a little IDL flag. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on set IDL or set file icon theme. I'm going to make sure that IDL is set. And once I've done this, I can pop over to our Explorer in Visual Studio Code, and we've got some profiles and a notebook, which we'll talk more about later here. And you'll see we have a nice little IDL flag icon present. If you are following along and installing this yourself, you'll see that you have a couple of other questions that you get asked about. Such as changing the icon theme for Visual Studio Code and also setting the default formatter to be our extension. One of the things that's very nice about Visual Studio Code, but can be a little bit overwhelming for those who are new to it, is that you have a lot of control over actions that happen when code saves. So formatting on save is the preference for Visual Studio Code, and you can set up the extension to automatically format your code whenever you save it. We have some details in our docs, and I'll show that here in just a second. But what I'm going to do right now, and I realize that I need to quickly change one of my settings, which is different than it should be after last night with our first webinar here. One of the main differences that you're probably going to notice when you first get started with the extension is if you have a workspace open, which in the context of Visual Studio Code, a workspace is really just a folder. It's a lot different from the kind of workspace concept that you had with the IDL workbench. But if you have Pro Code open, you'll probably see that some files look yellow or red. And this is because we actually report problems. Now, one of the things that you'll see, well, three things that you'll see here within this profile I've got open. We have name, and if I hover over this, it's going to say undefined variable name. If I hover over dat, it'll say unused variable dat, and if we hover over header, it'll say undefined variable header. Now, these three variables actually come from a save file, and we know nothing about them within the context of our procedure that we have here. So part of this is that the extension for Visual Studio Code does a static analysis to look for problems, and all of these problems get reported. Now, the setting that I changed originally is if you do not like this and you're a professional IDL programmer, you can turn this feature off completely. So just to show this real quick, because this might be a configuration that you want to change when you first start with this. If you go to our IDL sidebar, under quick access in the lower left, we have open extension settings. This opens up the settings view within Visual Studio Code, and it filters all the settings to only the ones that are provided by our extension. So this makes sure that you don't have to see the hundreds of options with other extensions or just Visual Studio Code behaviors by default. And if I select problem reporting, and if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see this option for report problems. So if you don't like that information about problems is reported to you, you can turn this off and you get a more vanilla experience like the IDL workbench. If I come back to our file, you'll see all of these problems have gone away. So that's probably going to be one of the biggest differences compared to the workbench if you have used the IDL workbench in the past. So if you don't like that behavior, you can turn it off yourself. As far as comparisons to the IDL workbench, one of the other differences is how Visual Studio Code starts and manages files that you have open. If you've used the IDL workbench before, probably, at least for me, one of the most annoying things was you could only really have one instance of the workbench open. Every instance of the workbench would need another Eclipse workspace, and the next time you would close all of them and open it up, it wouldn't open up by default your settings and preferences that you had originally set. With Visual Studio Code, I can press Control-Shift-N and I can start up a new instance of the editor. I can open up a new folder of code, and it all works like magic. I don't have to do anything special or fancy or different in order for this to work. So this is probably one of my favorite feature differences between Eclipse and VS Code is that you're no longer restricted to just having one instance. You can have multiple open if you want. And one of the recent changes to Visual Studio Code is that you can also undock editors as well. So you could just have one window open, and if you've got multiple monitors, you can move profiles or any other files in the editor around just to kind of suit your use case. Some of the other kind of key things you might see off the bat when you are interacting with code, if I hover over routines, you'll see that we have actually embedded basically a copy of our documentation as part of the extension. We get this nice syntax block, which compared to what you might see in our docs, this is something that you can copy and paste directly into your pro code. If I click on online docs here, and if I scroll down to our syntax blocks, you're probably familiar, if you've used this before, of seeing all these little square brackets around everything. This is a recent change that we actually made where this doesn't always provide the most help. And if you're really looking for a signature, routine signature, you might just want something you can copy and paste and delete the things you don't care about. But I can scroll down here. We have links that if you click on, this will take you to our documentation that's online, and you'll see information about keywords and other things like that. This also applies to user routines as well. So if I scroll up here, I have some IDL doc styled comments. If I hover over my routine I've got, you'll see it's got the description from up above and my little author tag that I added in as well. So full support for documentation and kind of that same style of user experience. One of the other differences, if we hover over like keywords, you'll see that we actually give you the documentation for that keyword specifically. And we'll tell you the type of it as well if we have that information either from the documentation or from user routines. So really kind of the goal here is that we want to make sure that users have all the information at their fingertips, so you don't have to be jumping back and forth between our online documentation and your editor. This was probably one of the things, especially as I was getting started with IDL, that I had to do a lot. I'd have the workbench open, and then I'd have, and on my other monitor, I'd have our documentation up. And now it's kind of just one tool to rule them all, in a sense. So just to talk about a few other things here, one thing that you might be curious about if you are familiar with IDL is, do I need to have IDL installed in order to run this extension? The answer to that question is no. So the basis for all the extensions in Visual Studio Code is actually a language called TypeScript. And all of the features and functionality for hover help and autocomplete as you're actually writing your code is based on TypeScript. So unless you want to run your code, you do not need IDL installed. This means you can, write code while you're traveling or on a plane, or, if you're away from your license server, whatever that might be, and just helps it be a little bit more flexible. This also makes it easy where if you have some code or notebooks, you can share those with other users, and as long as they have the extension installed in Visual Studio Code, they can see what you have created. So just an important kind of detail there. Let's see here. A couple other things before we get to some of the exciting stuff. So I'm going to pop open the settings and I'm going to call out a few kind of important options that I end up kind of changing every now and then. Kind of one of the first sections I want to call out here is formatting. So if you are new to Visual Studio Code, one of the things that you might not have noticed is you'll see this kind of blue line to the left of my first formatting option that we have here. This lets me know that that setting has changed from its default. For me, I have AutoDoc enabled. AutoDoc is when I format my code, automatically update and make the docs look consistent so that I don't have to be handcrafting documentation. This is one that really saves me time as I'm writing pro code, and so I recommend to turn that on if you're familiar with the IDL doc style. You can see some other options here for code formatting as well. The defaults are kind of what Chris, the team, and myself had decided on was kind of a good, we'll call it a modern appearance for IDL. And so one of the things we do recommend is if you are new to the extension, give it a try, see how it looks. I do recommend if you are formatting existing code, make sure you've got Git or some other source control installed so that you can maybe see a diff and look at the differences between your existing formatting and how the extension formats. Lastly, as far as settings go, IDL is the other important group of settings that you might need to go through and change. You have control over how your open workspace folders get added to IDL search path, which, to be clear, by default, any folder that you have open within Visual Studio Code will be added to IDL's path. So you don't need to micromanage that. It'll just all work automatically. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom here, I can add in other folders. This uses the same syntax style as the IDL preference, where I use a little plus sign beforehand, which will recursively add all of the folders in a directory, or I can just do the files in the immediate folder without the plus sign. These settings are universal. These get used when you start up IDL as a debug session, and also when we start up IDL notebooks. So trying to give you that kind of consistent user experience there, and we'll talk about notebooks a little bit more here in just a minute. So I think with that, we can get over my rambling here and we can jump to some of the fun stuff. And Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you so that we can talk a little bit about how we can run any IDL code that you've got.
All right, sounds great. Thank you, Zach. Let me share my screen here and hopefully that will come up. All right, do you guys see my my code on the screen?
Yep, coming through.
Excellent, great. So real quick before I actually jump into this, there were a couple questions that I already answered on the chat, but I just thought I would answer them here as well, so it's in the recording. So one question was about Visual Studio versus VS Code. So those are two completely different programs. Visual Studio is Microsoft's gigantic program for compiling C and C++ code. That's completely different than VS Code, which is their free editor that we're showing here. VS Code is a free download for Mac, Linux, and Windows, and it works great. I've actually pretty much completely switched from the IDL Workbench, and I also do all my other coding like TypeScript and JavaScript in it as well. And then speaking of the Workbench, there was another question about what's happening with the IDL Workbench, and Zach had mentioned the differences between VS Code and the Workbench. We have no plans to get rid of the Workbench or anything. It still works great. In fact, we just upgraded to the latest version of Eclipse to make sure that we can just keep going and have all the features, the modern features that Eclipse provides. Again, maybe that'll change in the future as time goes on. Right now there are still some differences between VS Code and the Workbench. A few things that the Workbench does better, and so we definitely won't be taking any of that away. So let me jump in here, and what I'm going to show is how to actually run IDL code using VS Code. And as Zach mentioned, you don't actually need to have IDL installed on your system to be able to use the editor. So everything that you're seeing here just comes for free. Everything's a free download or whatever. And so if you are running IDL, say off of a different system, maybe on a Unix system or something, but you want to edit your code on your own system, you're perfectly free to just use this as a fancy editor. But it really kind of becomes more powerful when you actually have IDL installed on the same machine. So on the left-hand side, I think Zach already showed, there's this IDL button here, and this gives you access to all of these different tools for running and debugging. And I've already started an IDL session, so I've hit the start button here. And this brings up this debug console. And like it says in the name, this is actually used for both running and for debugging. And so just like the IDL Workbench, you can see I can set breakpoints in here. If I go ahead and I run this program, it will actually stop at my breakpoint, and then I can look at variables. So I could hover over a variable. You can see here's a variable here. One interesting note, there's a little yellow squiggly under this, and that actually indicates that this is an unused variable. So the VS Code extension is smart enough to know that I've created this variable here, but I'm never using it for the rest of the program. And I've actually really found this helpful when I've been working on IDL's kind of core programs that we ship. You would be surprised at the number of unused variables that have crept in over the last 30 years. But I can do things like I can print out, say the value of a variable because I've stopped at a breakpoint. And again, I can examine the values up here. And let me just actually keep running. So I'll just hit the continue button here. And it's just going to run my program just like regular IDL. The graphics come up in a separate window, just like normal. So it works, just like IDL command line or the IDL Workbench as well. If you don't really need this kind of integrated debugger, you can just run your code in a separate terminal, just like as if you were editing, say, an Emacs or VI and just running your code that way. Typically, what I'll do is I'll actually use the embedded terminal within VS Code. And so VS Code, you can tell it to fire up a terminal, and it just gets embedded at the bottom, and you can just control the height of that. And so what I'll typically do is I'll be editing my code at the top, and then I'll just run IDL down here, and then I can just type my usual commands. So this, for example, is fear harm ex, and this will just run this code just like that. Obviously, if you run it this way, you don't get access to breakpoints. You can't hover over your variables to see the values, but that's kind of just the way terminals work. And feel free to type any questions that you might have, and Zach and I can answer those. So that's kind of how to run your code in the VS Code extension. But a lot of times you might have either users that maybe aren't familiar with IDL, or you just want to do something really ad hoc and really quick. And so one of the things that we've added to the extension is notebooks. And these are just like Python's Jupyter notebooks, except the key here is that you do not need to have Python or Jupyter installed at all. The whole notebook support in VS Code is built straight in. You don't have to download anything else. You get it for free. And if you go into the IDL icon on the left, we have several buttons over here, so you can create a brand new IDL notebook. When I do that, it'll just pop up a notebook. It wants me to pick a name. I'll just pick the default. And if you're not familiar with notebooks, it's just a really nice way of mixing both text. So this is just using Markdown. So here you can see I have a title and then a little subtitle under that, as well as code. And so this is just a code block. And you can see I've got hover help here, so I can open up the documentation. It's got chroma coding, and then you can just execute these commands, and it'll just put the output straight into the notebook, just like that. In fact, if I do plots, I can do something like that, and it will just embed the plot directly into the notebook. And there's actually some more comprehensive examples over on the left-hand side. I think Zach's going to go through those, so I won't do that. But let me show you my program here. And I forgot to say, actually, the program that I was running earlier is actually a new function for IDL 9.1, and it's doing a spherical harmonic analysis on data. So this is taking some weather data from the 1880s, and it's running it through this spherical harmonic transform. And let me switch to the notebook version of this. So you can see this just looks a lot nicer than my code, because I can actually have a nice title with a subtitle with the reference for the data. And then I can just go through and I can run these cells, and I can run them all individually one at a time, or you can actually just run all of them once you have your entire notebook done. Now let me do a plot of what the data looks like. So here's our air temperature data from 1884. And then you can see I now have a subheading. So here I'm going to do something else. I'm going to create this Gaussian quadrature Legendre, and then I'll plot that. And this is first, I should point out up here, this is a new graphics or a function graphics plot. So this is using objects. Down here, I'm just doing a plain old vanilla direct graphics plots. So if you're happier with direct graphics plots, you can do either one, and they all get embedded into the notebook. One other cool feature about notebooks is you'll notice there's this little save icon to the right of every single plot. If I click that, I get a dialog, and I can just save my image out to PNG and save it offline like that. So let me just keep running. I'll just actually click the run all button, and it'll just go through and do all of the analysis. And here we're taking the filter of the data. So I filtered it using this spherical harmonic transform. And then finally, in my very last plot, I'm showing the difference between these two. So for notebooks, it's
real quick, Chris.
Yeah, go ahead, Zach. Go for it.
Yeah, we've got a question in the chat.
Sure.
Where I know Git or version control struggles with Jupyter notebooks due to the underlying structure. Is this also true for IDL notebooks? So just a quick note here. So IDL notebooks are a JSON format, very similar to Jupyter notebooks as well. One of the things that we have done to try to help make sure that it is a little more friendly for source control is that it's always kind of pretty printed. So there's a little bit of formatting in the notebook file itself. So that'll help make it a little bit easier to track. I will say if you are using source control, the graphics and everything that Chris is showing, when you save your notebook, those graphics get embedded in it. So those graphics will come along with your source control. So it's very easy to get very large notebooks. So as long as you aren't saving all of your graphics, you should be in a pretty good state. So just a quick note on that as well. Like we have a couple of example notebooks that Chris had mentioned, and we contribute or commit those directly to our source control for the extension and package them as part of it. But they don't have any images embedded to keep them small and not overwhelmed yet. So
right. Yeah, good. That's a great point, Zach. In fact, what I've done here is, so I've run the whole thing. I've got all my graphics here. If I save it, it's going to embed all those graphics in the notebook. And this is nice because if you come back the next day, you're kind of good to go. You already have everything run up to this point, and you've got all your graphics. I can instead just say clear all outputs, and you can see that just takes it back down to the bare bones. And then if I go ahead and I look at this file, this sphere harm IDL DV, you can see that's 3 kilobytes. So it's a really rinky-dinky file. And in fact, if I open it with text edit, there is the JSON that Zach was talking about. So it's perfectly human readable. You can, in fact, if you really wanted to, I suppose you could go in and edit this JSON file and change the IDL code. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way, just because you might make typos with all the little curly braces and square brackets. But, totally readable. So let me run everything again here. And finally, one other point, I think Zach will talk about this a little bit more, but if you want to share this with someone else, a colleague, you can either share the actual notebook file itself, and then they could run it within VS Code themselves, or you can output to a PDF. And we have a little button here which lets you output to a PDF. And Zach, I'll let you explain how that works. So
sure.
That's pretty much it for notebooks. One final thing I just wanted to point out, there's been a lot of talk about ChatGPT and using AI and things to write code. And so the question has come up, well, how does this work with IDL? And it actually works surprisingly well. In fact, one of the benefits of using VS Code is you get all of these extensions that you can add. So for example, there's an extension for GitHub, there's one for Perforce, all these source control extensions. And so it's really easy and simple to add an extension. There's also an extension for GitHub Copilot, which is Microsoft's flavor of ChatGPT, but for coding. And I was playing around with this yesterday a little bit. In fact, I've saved, I could have just typed this in, but just so I don't make mistakes. So I just tried, how do I write an IDL program to read in a binary file and make a plot? And so you can imagine if you're new to IDL, or perhaps you just don't remember how to do something very esoteric like reading in a binary file, you can just ask GitHub Copilot. And in fact, it'll say, here's the IDL code that you need to write. And in fact, here's a big long explanation of what every single line of code does. And you could just copy this and paste it into your program here. And I guess I don't need 2 procedures there. And you can see that the code that it produced is perfectly acceptable. I don't have any squigglies, so it must have done it correctly. And in fact, it's actually also giving me little hints for other questions, like how can I customize the appearance? And if I click on that, it'll start talking about all the different keywords to plot that I can use to make my plot prettier. So, this is obviously not directly supported by us. And I will say that, IDL is not quite as mainstream as some languages, perhaps. And so every now and then you'll get some strange answers. If you try to ask it something very complex, it will sometimes spit out pretty bizarre IDL code. So just kind of, take its answers with a grain of salt, like any sort of AI output. So I think, any other questions come in, Zach?
Well, it looks like we've got a couple of them. So maybe a quick question related to ChatGPT. Is that another extension that you have to install to get that working, or is that just it? Yep. Okay.
No. Yeah, that's an extension. If you just go on to, I clicked on this little thing with the little boxes here. You just search for Copilot or GitHub Copilot, And in fact, if I just scroll down, here it is right here. I will say, I think you get the first month for free, and then you have to pay like, I don't know what it is, $10 a month afterward. So, and you know, again, that's nothing to do with us at all, and we don't really have any control over what's in there. And you do need, you know, like any of these kind of chat GPT type things, you need to be careful about where the code is coming from, things like copyright, and if you're distributing your own code. So just, you know, use it wisely, like any tool. What else?
So I think we've got a question about notebooks. So I'm actually gonna steal the screen share back, if that's okay, Chris.
Yep.
Just a second here. Screen should start coming through. So one of the questions that came through is, can I use the ENVI API with notebooks? Or maybe that was related to ChatGPT. I'm not 100% sure. But Chris showed this a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open this up. From our IDL sidebar and our little notebooks section, we have this open ENVI notebook example. So if you do have ENVI installed on your machine, and for those that aren't familiar, ENVI is a separate product. It requires a separate license, and its focus is really about processing and analyzing imagery, remotely sensed data. So you can use the ENVI API within notebooks. In fact, we have a couple of special APIs for being able to display data. You'll see I ran this yesterday, so I've got some outputs already saved and embedded where we can just display a multispectral data set over Boulder. If I scroll down a little bit more, we can show, you know, picking bands within notebooks, or, you know, showing the output of analytics like we've got here. There's some other little fun visualizations, like if you're working with hyperspectral data, where you can make your spectral data cube, which shows a little color table around the edges of the image with a nice RGB visualization on the top as well. So there's a lot of other ways that you can, oops, gotta rerun one of my cells up above that I skipped through. We have some other little animations that show kind of before and after. So if I scroll back down and rerun this cell, you'll actually see before and after of two images. So as long as your data sets have the same number of columns and rows, these visuals will line up quite nicely. There's also some ways that you can create maps and embed those in notebooks as well for imagery. So one of the things that is nice, you know, if I save my notebook, you know, you'll see this little kind of gray circle that shows I have unsaved changes. If I save this out, I can send my notebook to anyone else who has Visual Studio Code and the IDL for VS Code extension installed, and they can view this directly. Alternatively, as Chris mentioned, you can actually convert this to a PDF. If I click on this, and sometimes you have to click on it twice, if it's the first time that you've done it within a Visual Studio Code session. We actually use a third-party extension. We have a little bit of, we have a very short little kind of tips and tricks for getting it set up if you're having problems, but it will create a PDF for you. So this takes the text from your display, and you'll see the code blocks. They don't look super fancy, but it's good enough to share. You have images that get embedded in here. Any of the maps you'd use for or create from an ENVI perspective don't get embedded. We just embed little visuals of the imagery that you've got, and little animations and other things don't all carry through. But this is another way that you can share notebooks with other users as well. One of the other little kind of tips and tricks here is if you look up in the top right of your notebook display, right where it's got like a little pillar looking icon in IDL, you'll see there's a couple of other kind of controls for notebooks. We can reset and stop the IDL instance that's running behind the scenes for this notebook if you want to. It'll give you a little progress notification letting you know it's doing something. And we also have this icon that's convert IDL notebook to Pro Code. So if I click on this, this actually takes all of the markdown cells, converts them to comments, and all of your other programs are organized in the same order that you had in the notebook. So if you are using notebooks as a nice ad hoc way to program and get something done, you can convert these back to Pro Code and reuse those in other places. One of the things I will add is, like, we've got our special little ENVI notebook and IDL or ENVI notebook static methods. These don't work when you are in profiles. They're specifically for notebook environments. So you'll probably have to change some code if you're trying to make something reusable, but this is a nice way that kind of helps make it a little bit more flexible to jump between both of them. One of the other things, actually, I'm gonna call out here, I'm gonna open up our IDL example notebook, and I'm gonna scroll down to one of our cells that we've got, is any routine that you hover over, you'll actually have two little helpful links at the top of the hover help. You'll have a link to our online docs, which if I click on this, kind of as expected, takes you to the docs that live online. And if I click on the second example or second link, which is open examples in notebook, any examples that are a part of the documentation for that routine get converted directly to a notebook. So you get the syntax signature of the routine, as long as kind of the basic description. And then if I scroll down, we have the, there's only one example, I guess, for FinGen. But if this works for user routines, for documentation that we parse from your own code as well. So this is just a very nice way to learn a little bit more and easily try things out. For example, I can just hit the run button and it will print out an array, and then we'll give it a second and it will embed the plot as well. So no need to copy paste, generate a new file. It'll just all kind of magically work within the context of notebooks. So notebooks are also just a really nice place to kind of try things out. You don't have to create files on disk, no compiling. It's I think a lot better kind of user experience when you're just trying stuff out. So I think that is just about it for notebooks. I don't know if there's been any other kind of questions that have come in.
There have been a few questions, Zach. I don't know if you want to transfer the control back to me.
Sure.
One quick question I had for you, I was just about to answer it, but the question is, if IDL runs in a particular environment, and I'm assuming that means like something either defined by environment variables or perhaps like an IDL startup file, will the IDL notebook inherit that? And I'm assuming that, well, go ahead.
Yes, it should. So within the configuration options for our extension, you can actually set environment variables. So you have some basic control over like IDL startup. And every time you start a debug session, like through the debug console in Visual Studio Code or a notebook, it gets launched the same way behind the scenes. So same path, same environment variables. So you only have to set it up once and it works in both. There are some little, when Chris was showing like the terminal controls, terminals don't behave quite the same. They don't have quite the same level of integration with Visual Studio Code. So the behavior is a little bit different there. But if you're using notebooks or the debug console, it's should all work as you would expect.
Cool. Okay, and then let's see, there's a couple other questions. One was about projects. So VS Code has the concept of workspaces and folders. And so if you're coming from, say, the IDL workbench, what I would typically do is in VS Code, I would just say open folder or either open workspace from a file. So open folder will just let you navigate to any folder on your system. And so you can see here, I'm actually opening up. In fact, let me go up one level. I'll click on IDL workspace. And so this is my actual workbench workspace. So I'm just using the same workspace basically for VS Code. Now, obviously one thing is, the IDL workbench has a lot of things for what they call projects, where you can define like save files that you want to be created for a workspace. VS Code, our extension, doesn't support any of those specific project things. But in terms of opening up folders and having a hierarchy of files, it behaves similarly. So you can see here's all my different folders that I had inside my IDL workspace. And in fact, you can even edit these little workspace files outside of VS Code to bring in. You can bring in separate subfolders from different parts of your system even, and have them all in the same workspace. The other question that we had was, how did you actually use the chat? And so which I'm assuming they mean the GitHub Copilot. So I had to install this GitHub Copilot chat extension. And then once you do that, on the left-hand side, if you can see my mouse, there's this little chat button that will show up. If I click on that, then I just get a little window where I can type commands. And so I can ask it like, how would I write NV code to read in a, sorry, you have to watch me type, hyperspectral image and find vegetation. Let's see if it thinks it knows anything about this. Okay, it's babbling about NV, blah, blah. Let's see, here's a basic example. And so it's just gonna start presumably spewing out code. It looks like it wants me to use this NDVI, normalized difference vegetation. I'm not that familiar with ENVI, and so Zach can perhaps tell me if this is actually the best way to do it, but it's spitting out IDL code for using ENVI.
Yeah.
So
it's close.
Yeah, close. Okay.
It's close. It looks like there is one syntax error in there, but okay. Mileage varies with generative AI and the responses that it gets. But it does help you at least write code faster. Yeah, there's plenty of ways to do like NDVI to look for vegetation. So this is also nice because it shows you like what the expression is. So it's a good way to kind of learn a little bit more yourself. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then one last question that came in just to clarify. So with VS Code, your code is all organized in folders. You can obviously open up just individual files. We don't have the same support for building projects that the IDL Workbench has. However, with IDL itself, typically you can just build say if you want to compile all your code into a save file, you would just create an IDL program to do that, and then just run that. And so if you had a kind of a builder script that was written in IDL, then of course you could just run that within VS Code, but there's no like project file the same way that it exists in the IDL Workbench. And I hope that answered that question correctly.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do have on our list is actually the ability to compile ProCode that you have in workspaces. We have some kind of proof of concepts, but none of that has been added in and exposed yet throughout Visual Studio Code. But if you're specifically interested in the ability to convert your ProCode to save files, and you don't want to have to write those scripts, that's one of those things, like you said, that we're kind of working on. Can you actually open up the IDL sidebar for me real quick, Chris?
Sure. Yep.
And if you scroll look all the way at the bottom, you'll see that file a bug report. So anyone who's using this, yeah, can you click on that?
Sure.
So it doesn't have to be a bug report. It could also be a feature request. So if there's functionality that you guys think are missing from our extension, you can easily get to GitHub where all of this stuff is tracked. I don't think we actually said this last night or today so far. Our extension is completely open source. It's freely available. You can find it on GitHub. If there's bugs you want to report, we've got the little discussion area as well. And Chris and I are usually pretty responsive about commenting back and engaging on anything that pops up here. So great place to ask about features and functionality, and help make requests for stuff for us to do. So yeah, cool. That's about it.
All right, you can steal it back if you want.
Well, I think I guess I will steal. We've just got one more slide, and it's our questions and discussion, meaning that I think we've covered just about everything that we had on our target to do today. So thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions that didn't get answered, you can feel free to reach out to us. Typically, we get a list of all these questions and somebody internally will go through and get answers to them if we didn't answer them during the webinar. So someone should follow up with you. And as another reminder, the webinar is recorded. So this recording will be posted and a link will be sent out here in the next couple of business days. Same with a copy of our 7-slide presentation, pretty short and sweet here. So if you've got any other questions, feel free to send us an email, reach out to us on GitHub. We've got discussions on our GitHub page as well. Happy to, engage and help everybody use Visual Studio Code for IDL. So thanks for joining us, Chris, and we'll catch y'all later.